Boston wasn't always loud. There were nights long before the sirens and gunshots made the soundtrack of the streets, where you could still hear the ocean if you listened close enough. Back then, Southie still had some innocence. Kids played stickball, old men read the paper on porches, and the local barbershop had more gossip than the Boston Globe. But the innocence, like most good things, had a short life. Stephen Flemmi didn't start out a monster. That's what people don't get. No one's born with blood on their hands. That comes later, slowly, one stain at a time. And by the time you realize what you've become, the water's too red to wash off. He was born in 1934 in the heart of Boston to Italian immigrant parents. His father, Giovanni, worked for the railroad, a proud, tough man who believed in discipline, church, and family. Stephen had 5 brothers. They were loud, they fought, they shared shoes and dreams. Their mother, Mary, held them together with quiet strength. She had this way of looking at you like she could see all your lies before you opened your mouth. Stephen inherited her eyes. He wasn't stupid, not by a long shot. In fact, he was the kind of smart that scared teachers, calm, observant, and quiet. Too quiet, some would say. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. He was a street kid, sure, but with a brain ticking in ways no one could read. By the time he was a teenager, the war was ending, and Boston was changing. The docks were still busy, but the money was drying up for honest men. There were 2 kinds of people getting ahead in that city, politicians and criminals. Stephen wasn't interested in speeches. He joined the army at 17, not because he was patriotic, but because it was a way out. Vietnam hadn't happened yet, but the Korean War was getting hot and the U.S. needed bodies. He served as a paratrooper, doing recon work and training with some of the best. The military changed him. It sharpened him, gave him discipline, yes, but also taught him the art of silence, how to disappear in a room, how to watch people's hands more than their mouths, how to stay 3 steps ahead. But war also does something else. It makes you numb. After you've seen bodies broken in ways you can't explain to your mother, after you've killed a man who never even saw you coming, the idea of morality becomes negotiable. You come back and the world feels too slow, too soft. Stephen came back with medals and scars, but no peace. Boston welcomed him like it does most veterans. A handshake, a parade, then back to the grind. He tried. Worked a few jobs, kept quiet, but the streets were calling, and he wasn't deaf. By the early 1950s, Boston's underworld was evolving. The Irish mob was strong. The Winter Hill Gang, led by Howie Winter, was beginning to take real shape. On the Italian side, the Patriarca crime family ran Providence and had their claws in Beantown too. Turf lines were thin and bloody. Stephen, with his military mind and cold eyes, found a fit where most couldn't, right in the center of both worlds. He wasn't full-blooded Italian enough for the traditional mafia. But the Winter Hill Gang, they liked results more than bloodlines. And Stephen delivered. He started small, collections, intimidation, protection rackets. But he had a way of doing things. Clean, precise. No witnesses, no mess. He didn't yell, didn't grandstand like some of the other muscle. His style was colder. You owed money, you paid, or you vanished. Simple. He met James Whitey Bulger in the 1960s. That friendship would later be the root of all nightmares, for both of them. Whitey was a madman, charismatic, dangerous, unpredictable. But he was also smart, terrifyingly smart. He saw something in Stephen that most missed. Not just muscle, not just a killer, but a thinker. They clicked. Together, they turned Boston into their playground. Drugs, extortion, loan sharking, arms dealing, you name it, they had a hand in it. And if you crossed them, your body ended up in a shallow grave out in Dorchester or Quincy. Or sometimes you just disappeared. No funeral, no name in the paper, just gone. But here's where the story twists, because while Stephen was busy building an empire of fear, he was also playing a second game. With the FBI, that's right. The same man who choked people with phone cords and buried enemies in snowbanks was also an informant, feeding the feds information, selling out rivals, clearing the path for his own rise. He wasn't the only one. Whitey was in on it too. Together, they manipulated law enforcement like puppets. Stephen would hand over tips about the mafia. In return, the FBI looked the other way when his crew filled the streets with blood. Double life, 2 masks, one face in the street, another in the interrogation room. But it came at a price, always does. Stephen couldn't sleep. Not really. Not the kind of sleep that rests the soul. He had nightmares, some about war, others about the people he'd silenced. But the worst ones, those came later. When he started dreaming about the families, the wives who never knew why their husbands didn't come home, the kids who waited for fathers that would never walk through the door again. He'd wake up in sweat, sometimes with a gun in his hand, paranoid, watching shadows, drinking until the dreams dulled. He never told anyone, not even Whitey. Gangsters don't talk about fear. But it ate at him, slowly, quietly. And the thing about double lives, eventually, one kills the other. Stephen's story ain't a fairy tale. There's no redemption arc here, just choices, blood, and consequences. But before we get to the fall, the betrayal, the trials, the rats turning on rats, you've got to understand the rise. The slow poison that turned a soldier into a monster, and a monster into a ghost. That's the only way to understand the man behind the silence. And trust me, there's a lot of silence coming. Most men don't notice when their soul starts slipping. Stephen Flemmi did. He just chose to let it go. The 1960s in Boston were a time of smoke-filled pool halls, political corruption, and blood-soaked handshakes. The line between law and outlaw was blurrier than ever. Cops took envelopes like bartenders took tips. Judges nodded to killers in courtrooms like they were old high school buddies. And the FBI? They were more interested in headlines than handcuffs. Stephen fit in like a ghost in a graveyard. By the time the Winter Hill Gang reached its prime, Stephen had become a name whispered more than spoken. He didn't shout, didn't draw attention like some of the flashier gangsters in the North End, who wore suits like armor and rode Cadillacs like royalty. Stephen was quieter, more dangerous. He was the kind of man who stood behind the loudest guy in the room and made the loudest guy dance with a nod. But before he became the right hand of Whitey Bulger, before the betrayal, the bodies, and the beds he couldn't sleep in, Stephen was still finding his way into the underworld's darker corners. At first, it was all about loyalty. Loyalty to Howie Winter, to the Irish who gave him a seat at the table when the Italians wouldn't. The mob was tight about bloodline. Stephen, half Italian, wasn't full-blooded enough to get made in the Patriarca family. But Winter didn't care about blood. He cared about results. And Stephen brought results. He knew how to collect without causing heat, knew when to scare, when to smile, and when to kill. He became known for being surgical, never sloppy, never emotional. He handled debtors who ran, rivals who talked too much, and even his own when they slipped up. They called him the Rifleman, not because he used a rifle, but because of how clean his hits were. Military precision, in and out, no mess, no trail. One story went around about a man named Donnie Morlino, small-time loan shark who started stepping into Winter Hill turf. Stephen didn't warn him twice, didn't raise his voice, just walked into Donnie's diner one morning, sat down with him over pancakes, and by the end of the meal, Donnie was gone. Word had it he walked into the freezer to get something and never came back out. They never found the body. But the smell lingered for weeks, and no one stepped on that turf again. Stephen never blinked, but even ghosts have shadows, and his shadow was getting longer. It started with the FBI. See, Boston's organized crime scene was spinning out of control. The Irish were bleeding the city from one side, the Italians from the other. The Bureau wanted to crush the mafia, make headlines, grab promotions, and the easiest way in, use the Irish to get the Italians. So when FBI agent John Connolly approached Stephen with a deal, it didn't come with handcuffs. It came with a cigarette, a smirk, and an open door. The offer was simple. You feed us intel on the Patriarca family, and in return, we turn a blind eye to your business. No raids, no taps, no pressure. Just silence for silence. Stephen didn't say yes right away. he wasn't stupid. He knew informants didn't last long, but the world was changing. And if there was one thing the army taught him, it was this. Survival isn't about honor, it's about advantage. He said yes. He gave them scraps at first. Meeting times, names, a few smuggling routes. Nothing too dangerous. But the feds were greedy. The more you feed them, the hungrier they get. And Stephen? He was too smart to not see the game, so he flipped it. He started giving them intel that benefited him, removing rivals, sabotaging deals he wasn't part of, framing outsiders who threatened his empire. He wasn't just playing both sides, he was playing them like a violin. And in the background of it all, Whitey was watching. James Whitey Bulger was as unpredictable as Boston's weather, charming one minute, monstrous the next. Where Stephen was calm and cold, Whitey was wild and brutal. But they needed each other. Whitey had muscle, presence, reputation. Stephen had connections, information, and the mind of a tactician. Together, they became untouchable. And together, they became informants, secretly working with the FBI while their hands stayed soaked in blood. It was a sick dance. The two most dangerous men in Boston feeding the feds what they wanted while killing anyone they pleased, all under the FBI's protection. Stephen once said, "Being an informant isn't betrayal, it's insurance." But that's the lie all traitors tell themselves to sleep better. And even then, he didn't sleep much, because with every name he whispered, a ghost followed him. His life became a maze of secrets. One path led to the mob, another to the FBI, another to Whitey, and each one was lined with bodies. Some he remembered, some he forgot, some he tried to. There was a girl, Maria, a waitress at a dive bar in Roxbury. Brown hair, soft voice, eyes that didn't flinch when she looked at him. Stephen used to sit at the bar just to hear her talk. She didn't care who he was, or pretended not to. They saw each other for a few months, quietly. He even smiled around her, the real kind, not the fake gangster grin. For a moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, he could have something normal. But then she asked too many questions, and one night, she didn't come into work. They found her body in the Charles River 2 weeks later. He never asked who did it, never followed up. Maybe it was Whitey, maybe it was someone else in the gang who thought she was a snitch. Or maybe the order came from Stephen himself, in a moment of panic. Some say he cried. Some say he didn't blink. Either way, he never went back to that bar again. By 1975, the Winter Hill Gang was no longer just a neighborhood outfit. They had their hands in everything. Gambling, drugs, arms, unions, construction, even politics. The money flowed like whiskey. But so did the blood. Stephen oversaw more hits than most mafia captains. Some say he had a ledger, names crossed off in red. Others say he kept it all in his head. But no one ever saw him kill. That was the difference. Whitey left messes, Stephen left questions, and the sleep. It got worse. He started drinking more, started seeing faces in crowds that weren't there, started locking every door 3 times, sleeping with the radio on just to drown out the silence. You see, it's easy to kill a man. It's harder to live with it. Every noise became a memory. Every whisper sounded like a name, and sometimes at night he'd sit in the dark and wonder if there was a hell. Not the fire and brimstone kind, but the one where you're forced to relive every sin you ever committed, over and over without escape. Stephen was building his empire on a graveyard, and graveyards are quiet for a reason. Still, he kept going. Because that's what gangsters do. They bury their guilt under routine. They show up, shake hands, give orders, cash checks. They act like gods in the daylight, even when their nights are haunted. But deep down, even Stephen knew the truth. You can only walk a double line for so long before it splits. And when it does, one version of you dies. The question is, which one? Most people who work in crime, they say it's about money. Stephen knew better. Money was just the excuse. By the late 1970s, Boston belonged to the Winter Hill Gang. The streets didn't say it out loud, but the truth sat in every bar, every bookie joint, every corner where a man smoked a cigarette too quietly. The Irish crew wasn't just surviving anymore, they were running the show. And at the center of it all, pulling strings with ghost hands, was Stephen Flemmi. He didn't crave the spotlight. He let Whitey Bulger take the heat. Let him be the face of violence, the one who strutted, shouted, and ruled with an iron fist soaked in blood. But behind every decision, behind every body dumped in a shallow grave, there was Stephen, calculating, cold, and always watching. He never looked dangerous. That was his gift. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear gold chains or drive flashy Cadillacs like the North End wise guys. Stephen wore plain clothes, drove modest cars, and lived in a condo that looked like any other on the block. But inside, he was something else. He kept a Rolodex of names in his head, people who owed, people who talked, people who needed to disappear. He ran his crew like a soldier ran a war campaign, disciplined, efficient, and without sentiment. Whitey once said, "Steve don't blink unless it's to aim." And that wasn't far from the truth. Together, they ruled Boston's underworld like gods wearing cheap suits. But gods bleed too. It started small. A man named Paulie Sinelli went missing in '77. Paulie was a bookie tied to the Patriarca crime family down in Providence. He was skimming money off the top, feeding it to an up-and-coming crew trying to push into Winter Hill territory. Paulie wasn't brave. He was stupid. Stephen found out. What happened next never made the papers, never showed up in court. But word on the street was, Stephen invited Paulie to dinner, just the two of them. Italian food, wine, old records playing in the background. They say Paulie laughed during that meal, told stories, thought he was being forgiven. After dessert, Stephen walked him into the bathroom and strangled him with a belt. Calm, no struggle. Just a long silence and a soft thud. That was Stephen's way. He didn't shout, didn't get emotional. He made killing look like a math problem. They buried Paulie in a construction site up in Revere. Cement poured over his bones before sunrise. No one ever found him. Stephen went home that night, washed his hands twice, and stared in the mirror for a long time. Not because he felt guilt, but because for a moment, he felt nothing. And that scared him more than anything. The deeper Stephen sank, the more twisted things became. His relationship with Whitey was no longer just business, it was survival. They were bound by blood, blood they spilled together, blood they swore would never reach the surface. But Whitey was changing, becoming reckless. He started killing out of paranoia, started torturing people for pleasure, not necessity, started seeing enemies in every shadow. And Stephen? He watched. He didn't always agree, but he didn't stop him either. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't kill out of passion. He killed out of silence, and that silence, it was spreading. The FBI was still protecting them, still turning a blind eye. Stephen fed them more intel, just enough to keep their leash loose. He gave them low-level mafia names, told them about drug shipments that didn't matter, dropped dime on men who were already on their way out. It was all theater, smoke and mirrors. But every lie built a wall between him and the world outside. He couldn't go anywhere without checking exits, couldn't sleep without a gun nearby, couldn't trust anyone, not his men, not his friends, not even himself. By 1979, he stopped trying to feel normal. He had a brother, Michael Flemmi, a Boston cop, a good one, honest, the kind of man their father would have been proud of. They didn't talk much. Michael knew something wasn't right, of course. You can't be blood with a man like Stephen and not feel the darkness leaking through. But he stayed out of it, stayed clean. Stephen used to visit him once a month, pretend to catch up, ask about family. Look around the house like he was studying a life he'd never have. The kind with birthday parties and dog hair on the couch. One night, while Michael's kids were watching cartoons in the next room, Stephen said something strange. "I had a dream last night," he muttered, eyes fixed on the TV. Michael didn't respond. He waited. Stephen continued. "I was standing on a bridge, real high, fog everywhere. I couldn't see the water, but I could hear it, loud, like it was calling." "What happened next?" Michael asked. Stephen stared ahead for a long time. "I jumped." Michael turned to him. "Then what?" Stephen blinked. "I woke up." They never talked about it again. By the early 80s, Stephen's life had become a puzzle no one could finish. Half gangster, half ghost. The FBI still called him top echelon informant. That label bought him protection, made him feel untouchable. But power like that comes with a price. And that price is paranoia. He stopped trusting the FBI, started suspecting bugs in his own house. He'd walk through every room at night, tapping walls, checking light fixtures. He had someone sweep his car for trackers twice a week. He stopped talking on phones unless the lines were secured. It wasn't guilt. It was survival. The underworld was shifting again. Younger crews were rising. The mafia was starting to adapt. And whispers started floating. Rumors that Whitey and Stephen were rats. Stephen knew those whispers could kill. It only took one person believing it for the whole house of cards to fall. So he did what he always did. He got ahead of it. More bribes, more hits, more silence. But in that silence, the darkness began to mutate. One of the worst things about leading a double life is this: you forget which face is yours. Stephen wasn't just hiding from the FBI or from the mafia or from law enforcement. He was hiding from himself. He started keeping notebooks, small black journals he never let anyone see. He'd write in them late at night, when even the whiskey couldn't drown the echoes. He didn't write names, just thoughts. Today I didn't flinch when I saw the blood. Sometimes I wonder if I was always like this. I think I miss Maria. I heard her voice in the hallway. No one was there. These weren't the words of a gangster. These were the words of a man slipping. He started dreaming of the war again, not the explosions or the screaming, just the silence after. That eerie, heavy quiet after a firefight, when the bodies are still and you can hear yourself breathe. He'd wake up soaked in sweat, thinking he was still in a jungle, rifle in hand. Except now, the enemies had familiar faces. By the end of 1983, the Winter Hill Gang was a machine of blood and cash. And Stephen Flemmi was its heart. He didn't need orders. He gave them, didn't ask for permission. He moved quietly, like a shadow across Boston's underbelly. But shadows can't hide forever. The FBI was growing uneasy. New agents were coming in, young, hungry, idealistic. They didn't understand the old deals, didn't respect the handshake politics that had protected Stephen and Whitey for years. Some started asking questions, some started digging. Stephen could feel the ground shifting under his feet. It wasn't panic, not yet, but it was close. And all the while, the ghosts lined up in the corners of his room, waiting for their turn to speak. They always do in the end. The hardest part of living a double life isn't keeping your story straight. It's watching the people around you start to believe one version, while the other one kills them quietly. Boston winters were cruel. Snow fell like ash. The cold didn't just bite. It lingered, crept under doors, settled in bones. For men like Stephen Flemmi, the cold brought memories, bad ones. Blood froze slower in winter. Bodies didn't rot as fast. You could bury a man in December and not worry until April. That's exactly what happened to Arthur Bucky Barrett. He was an old thief, mid-level, smart but greedy. Too greedy for his own good. Used to run armored car jobs back in the 70s. Bucky had a thing for cash, didn't trust banks. Didn't trust people either. That's what made him careful, but not careful enough. By 1983, Bucky was semi-retired, living quiet in Quincy. Word was he'd stashed away over $40,000 in cash, maybe more. He was out of the game, but everyone knew where the bones were buried in Boston. And Bucky? He had stories worth gold. Whitey wanted that money. Stephen didn't argue. It was supposed to be simple, just a scare. Maybe lean on him a little. Whitey always wanted more than necessary. He didn't believe in warnings. He believed in erasing problems. They lured Bucky into a South Boston house under some friendly pretense, something about a business opportunity. He trusted Stephen, at least more than he trusted Whitey. That's what got him killed. Stephen led him down into the basement. What happened next never made the papers, but the FBI files, years later, told enough. Whitey was waiting, with a rope, duct tape, a chair. Bucky panicked, of course, tried to reason with them, begged even, said he didn't know anything, promised money, names, anything. But Whitey didn't want names. He wanted leverage. And he wanted Bucky broken first. They tied him up, beaten, humiliated, tortured, the kind of thing only sick men invent on the spot. Stephen watched it first, then he participated. Not because he wanted to, because by that point, loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. You showed weakness in that basement, and you might be the next one in the chair. They forced Bucky to give up the money, hidden in a safe in his house. After he talked, Whitey shot him in the head, right there, chair still rocking. Stephen helped bury the body in the dirt floor beneath the basement. No gravestone. Just cement and silence. Later that night, he sat in his condo, lights off, gun on the table, staring at his own reflection in the glass. There was blood on his hands still, not much, just under the fingernails. He didn't move, didn't sleep. It wasn't the first man he helped kill, but this one stuck. Because Bucky trusted him, because he saw the fear in his eyes, because that day, Stephen didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like the devil. From that day on, the cold didn't leave him. Whitey didn't even flinch, treated it like a Tuesday, picked up the cash, cracked a joke, and went back to running rackets like nothing happened. But Stephen changed. He didn't say it out loud, not even to himself. But the guilt settled in. It didn't scream, it whispered, late at night, in the quiet moments. During long drives when the city lights passed like ghosts outside his window. He stopped writing in his notebook, stopped visiting his brother, started drinking more than usual. There were days he wouldn't speak to anyone, just sit in his office, blinds drawn, radio on static. The power didn't feel like power anymore. It felt like chains. Tension started to build inside the Winter Hill gang. Guys like Kevin Weeks and John Martirano were watching. They didn't say much, but they noticed the shift. Stephen was pulling away, less involved, less present, less ruthless. Whitey noticed too, and when Whitey noticed something, it became dangerous. Stephen wasn't stupid. He knew what was happening. In the mob, weakness smells like blood, and once it's in the air, the wolves start circling. He tried to compensate, took on a few more jobs, made himself visible, barked orders louder than necessary. But it wasn't the same. The cold in him had changed something. He wasn't just losing sleep, he was losing control. And worst of all, he was losing trust from the only man who mattered in his world. There was a meeting in early 1984, just him and Whitey. Late at night, empty bar in Dorchester, whiskey on the table, snow outside like a dead man's blanket. Whitey stared at him for a long time before speaking. "You good, Steve?" Stephen sipped his drink. "Yeah." Whitey leaned back. "You sure? You've been, distant." "I've been tired." Whitey's eyes narrowed. "Tired don't exist in our line of work. You know that." Silence sat between them like a third man. Then Whitey said something that chilled Stephen deeper than any winter wind. "You start feeling things, you start losing things. That's how it works." Stephen didn't respond. Whitey finished his drink and stood. "You're either all in or you're out. And you know what happens when you're out." Stephen nodded once. The message was clear. Behind the scenes, the FBI situation was growing unstable. More agents were questioning the protection Whitey and Stephen were getting. Internal investigations started. Some of the old guards who had protected them, like Agent John Connolly, were coming under heat. Stephen could smell it. He started thinking about exit strategies. But there's no clean way out of a life built on corpses. He began stashing cash in offshore accounts, set up shell companies, laid groundwork for disappearing in case the ground caved under him. But Whitey wasn't thinking about escape. He was thinking about consolidation, power, fear, control. And Stephen was starting to see something terrifying. Whitey wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was becoming something else, paranoid, cold, almost inhuman. The man who once used fear as a tool was now being consumed by it. Stephen watched as Whitey became more violent, more unhinged. He'd kill over whispers, over looks, over the wrong word said in the wrong place. He was obsessed with bugs, taps, rats. Irony, considering they were both rats. Stephen once joked, "If I ever disappear, you'll be the one who made it happen." Whitey didn't laugh. One night in 1985, Stephen got a call. A low-level dealer in Charlestown had been caught talking to the DEA. Whitey wanted to make an example. Stephen was expected to be there. He went, but he didn't touch the kid, just watched. Whitey beat the man to death with a pipe, slow, loud, messy. Stephen didn't flinch, didn't speak, but when it was over, he went home and vomited. Something had cracked inside him that night, something that wouldn't heal. He realized something then, maybe too late. He'd become exactly what he feared, not a monster, but a captive, not to the FBI, not even to the gang, but to Whitey, to the silence, to the fear, to the life he'd chosen, and the souls he could no longer bury. Sometimes when you bury too many people, you forget they were ever alive. But the city doesn't forget, and it never forgives. By 1986, the word on the street wasn't just whispered anymore. It was spoken in cautious tones, behind thick bar doors, in back alleys and dark corners. Something's coming. Boston wasn't stupid. The old-timers had seen it before, when gangs overreached, when blood stained the sidewalks too long, when the bodies piled faster than the lies. There's a point where even crooked cities start to choke on their own silence, and the Winter Hill Gang. They were knee-deep in that silence. Stephen Flemmi felt it in his bones. There was a shift in the air. The streets didn't move the same. Eyes lingered longer, doors shut quicker. Even the crooked cops started avoiding handshakes. Something had changed. And for the first time in years, Stephen knew they were being hunted. Not by the mafia, not by some rival crew, but by their own protectors. The FBI had gotten sloppy. Their deal with Whitey and Stephen, keeping them off the radar in exchange for information on the Patriarca family, was supposed to be quiet, controlled, strategic. But power makes men lazy. Agent John Connolly, the man who'd practically given them a golden key to the city, was losing his grip. Rumors of corruption were circling the bureau. Internal affairs had started sniffing around. A few younger agents were asking questions. Why are we protecting murderers? How deep does this go? They were right to ask. Stephen had already seen the writing on the wall, long before the others. He watched how Connolly's calls got shorter, how meetings became tense, how the once cocky agent started showing up looking over his shoulder. The old trust between Gangster and Badge, it was cracking. Stephen wasn't just worried about law enforcement anymore. He was worried about Whitey. Whitey had become unpredictable, the kind of paranoid that couldn't be reasoned with. He was moving money, shifting safe houses, watching his own crew like they were all suspects. And in his twisted world, they were. Then came the Deborah Hussey murder. That was the one that shook the bones of Boston. Deborah was young, just 26, bright but broken. She had fallen into drugs, prostitution, the kind of street life that swallows people whole. Her mother, Marion Hussey, was Stephen's longtime girlfriend. That's right. Deborah was like a stepdaughter to him. He'd known her since she was a kid, bought her gifts, took her to dinner with Marion, smiled at her like family. And still, he helped kill her. Why? Because Whitey said she was a liability. Because she'd started talking, not just to friends, to people who might have been feds. She knew too much. She'd heard too many conversations behind closed doors. Stephen had brought her too close. Whitey decided she had to go. Stephen didn't argue. He lured her to a house under the pretense of help. They said she walked in laughing, naive, hopeful. They strangled her in the basement. Stephen didn't flinch. Later, they buried her next to Deborah Davis, Stephen's former girlfriend, another woman who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, another name in the ground. The press never knew the full story. But the streets did. And when the whispers started, Flemmi killed his own. Something in the city shifted. The fear turned to disgust. That murder broke something in Stephen, not immediately, not in some dramatic, soul-shaking way, but slowly, quietly. He couldn't go near Marion after that, couldn't look her in the eye. She cried for months, not knowing the truth. still hoping her daughter might come home, still clinging to the false kindness of a man who had murdered her child. Stephen didn't sleep much after that. The dreams weren't just noise anymore, they were faces. And the FBI, they knew. They knew what had happened. Maybe not the full details, maybe not the body. But they weren't stupid. They knew Stephen Flemmi had killed people close to him, and still, they protected him. Why? Because he was useful. Because he gave them dirt on the mafia. Because America loves a good villain, as long as he helps take down the bigger monster. But even monsters get old. Stephen was aging fast. His hands didn't move as quick. His back ached in the mornings. The whiskey didn't numb like it used to. He started thinking about retirement. Whitey laughed the first time he mentioned it, said there was no such thing for men like them. "You don't retire from this life," he said. "You rot in it." Stephen knew he was right, but that didn't stop the planning. Offshore accounts, quiet properties in Canada, new passports, just in case. He even met with a banker under a fake name in Montreal, pretended to be some quiet businessman looking to invest. The man never knew he was shaking hands with a killer. Stephen thought maybe, just maybe, he could disappear, leave the blood behind, find peace. But peace wasn't made for men like him. In 1987, the FBI got a tip, not from Stephen, not from Whitey, from somewhere outside the chain. A low-level guy connected to the mafia, trying to trade information for a reduced sentence, claimed the Winter Hill gang had murdered Deborah Davis and that Flemmi had been involved. It wasn't concrete, it wasn't actionable, but it started something. Investigators opened cold case files, journalists got wind of connections. The name Stephen Flemmi began showing up in stories again, not about gambling, not about drugs, but about murder, real names, real victims. And the FBI? They panicked. The informant program wasn't meant to protect serial killers, but that's exactly what it had done. Public outrage was growing. Political pressure followed. Stephen watched the whole thing unfold from behind his dark glasses, behind a poker face that no one could read. He started asking himself something he hadn't dared in years. What if they turn on me? What if the FBI, in a bid to save face, threw him under the bus? What if they needed a fall guy? What if John Connolly cut him loose? Stephen had lived his life surviving the streets, navigating betrayal and blood. But this was different. This was the machine turning on its own parts. And he was just a bolt waiting to be stripped. By 1989, the Winter Hill gang was no longer a legend. It was a liability. The mafia was regrouping. The drug trade was shifting to newer, younger crews. The FBI was under internal review. Agents were being rotated, some removed. John Connolly was sweating, trying to hold his kingdom together with duct tape and old lies. And Whitey was watching everyone. He carried a scanner to track police radio traffic, changed safe houses like socks, had 2 getaway cars parked in random spots across Boston, trusted no one, not even Stephen. Stephen noticed. The conversations got colder, the plans tighter. There were no more jokes, no more brotherly banter, only quiet meetings, exchanged glances, and long silences. At night, Stephen would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, not at the shadows, at the patterns. Every empire falls. Every wolf eventually finds another wolf at his throat. And in his gut, Stephen knew. Whitey Bulger was going to kill him. It's not the gun to your head that kills you. It's the silence before the trigger pulls. That's when you hear everything you've tried to forget. Stephen Flemmi wasn't scared of death. He was scared of being next. By 1990, the Winter Hill gang wasn't just bleeding. It was rotting from the inside. Deals were falling through. Drug operations were being watched. The mafia was pushing back. And the FBI was unraveling like a cheap suit in the rain. Stephen had lived through gang wars, mob betrayals, crooked judges, and cold-blooded executions. But this was different. This was the system breaking down, and he was tied to every inch of it. The protection they'd built over 2 decades was slipping. One agent had been transferred, another retired early, a third was caught destroying files. And at the center of the storm, Agent John Connolly. The man who once played God for them was now drowning in his own corruption. Media outlets had started circling him like vultures, connecting him to too many dead men and too many unsolved cases with one common thread: Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi. Stephen stopped sleeping altogether. He'd lie awake at night in his condo in Milton, lights off, blinds drawn, clutching a revolver and staring at the shadows like they were old friends waiting to finish the job. He knew what was coming, and so did Whitey. Whitey had changed, not just paranoid, but surgical. He started running background checks on his own men, watching who talked to who. Reading body language like scripture. A nervous twitch, a look the wrong way, a late phone call. That was all it took for a man to disappear. Stephen wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of dying without understanding why. Whitey stopped including him in certain conversations. Meetings happened without him. Safe house addresses changed. Men were showing up dead with no explanation. And then Stephen noticed something worse. He was being followed, not by cops, not by rival crews, by Whitey's people. It was subtle. A car that showed up on the same street 3 times, a man in a jacket that never changed, always on his way to somewhere. A parked van 2 blocks away with fogged windows and nothing else. Stephen had trained men like this in the army. He knew surveillance, and now he was the target. He called Whitey out on it. Once. They were sitting in the back room of a bakery in Dorchester. Smell of yeast and powdered sugar in the air. Boxes stacked high around them like shields. Whitey sat chewing a biscotti like it was a bone. "You following me?" Stephen asked, calm but direct. Whitey didn't look up. "Why would I?" "Because I've seen the same faces 3 days in a row." Whitey smirked, wiped crumbs from his mouth. "Maybe you're just seeing ghosts, Steve." Stephen leaned forward. "Or maybe I'm seeing a setup." Now Whitey looked up, and in that moment, something passed between them. A crack. A flicker of something that had once been loyalty, but was now just static. "Relax," Whitey said. "You're too important to me." That was worse than a threat, because Stephen had told that same lie right before burying someone. That night, Stephen opened his private safe for the first time in months. Inside, $50,000 in cash, 2 burner passports, a revolver, and a notebook titled Exit Plan. He'd started it back in '85, when the first real doubts crept in. Just notes, really. Safe houses in Vermont, contacts in Montreal, a guy in Nova Scotia who could fake identities for a price. He was done waiting to be hunted. He called a fixer named Arnie, who lived outside Worcester. Arnie had been quietly helping gangsters disappear for 30 years, sometimes to Florida, sometimes to Europe, sometimes to the bottom of the river. Stephen asked for 2 sets of IDs, one for him, one for someone else, unnamed. He was thinking about taking Marion with him. He still saw her now and then, even after what happened to her daughter. She never suspected. Still thought Deborah had run off with the wrong man. Still believed the lie that Stephen had done all he could to help. He almost respected her for it. That kind of blind love, it was rare in his world. But love wasn't enough to fix what was coming. Then came the indictment. In late 1990, a federal grand jury was formed to investigate FBI misconduct in Boston. Not a street rumor, not a whisper, an actual, real, no-joke investigation backed by Washington. The news hit the city like a bomb. Headlines screamed betrayal. Politicians scrambled. Agents panicked. And the name Stephen Flemmi was written between every line, even if it wasn't printed yet. Stephen got a call from an old FBI contact. "Clean your house," the man said, and hung up. Whitey called the next day. "We need to talk." They met in a cemetery. Of all places, St. Joseph's, just past the Red Line, the kind of place where ghosts outnumbered visitors. Whitey was already there, standing near a headstone like he was visiting family. He didn't say hello. "They're closing in," he said. Stephen nodded. "I know. We need to go." Stephen blinked. "Go?" Whitey turned to him. "Disappear. Lay low for a while. Let it blow over. I've got places." Stephen paused. "Together?" Whitey looked him in the eye. like old times. But Stephen wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat. After that, everything accelerated. Phone calls became code. Meetings were shuffled last minute. Safe houses were stocked with supplies like bunkers. Every bag was half-packed. Every envelope of cash counted twice. Stephen didn't trust Whitey anymore, but Whitey didn't trust anyone. And then something happened that would finally break the illusion. A body surfaced, an old hit, decades old, preserved by the cold. DNA had improved, forensics too. And now, suddenly, a murder that had once been lost in the fog was back. And it had Stephen's fingerprints on it, not literally, but enough to make a case. The feds came knocking, not with smiles, not with deals, with warrants. Stephen knew this was it. He had three choices. 1. Run. Disappear with Whitey. Trust a man he knew would eventually kill him. 2. Flip. Turn informant on the FBI and Whitey both. Try to save himself with the same game he once played. 3. Fight. Lawyer up, stay loyal, and hope the machine didn't swallow him whole. He had 24 hours to decide. And that night, he didn't sleep. In the dark, alone in his apartment, Stephen sat on the floor and opened an old box of photos. War photos, family photos, pictures of Deborah Davis, of Marion, even a few of Deborah Hussey when she was just a little girl with a plastic tiara and missing front teeth. He stared at her face for a long time. That was the moment something finally broke. Not cracked, snapped, not out of guilt. That was long gone, but out of exhaustion. He had run for so long, lied for so long, betrayed for so long, he didn't even remember who the hell he was anymore. Was he Stephen Flemmi the gangster? Stephen Flemmi the informant? Stephen Flemmi the killer of women he claimed to love? Or just some old man, surrounded by ghosts, waiting for the door to bust open? He picked up the phone, dialed a number, waited, and when the voice answered, he didn't stutter. I need to talk. Every man thinks he'll see it coming. The moment everything ends, the betrayal, the cuffs, the final look in the mirror. Stephen Flemmi didn't see it because he was too busy looking over his shoulder. January 1995. Boston was frozen over. Snow piled against windows like nature itself was trying to bury the city. The streets were silent save for the wind and the faraway echo of sirens. The newspapers were loud, though, louder than they'd been in years, because the headlines were screaming one name again: Whitey Bulger. Stephen Flemmi was sitting in his condo, alone, drinking black coffee from a chipped mug. He hadn't slept. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Cornered. He got in the call at 6:13 a.m., not a warning, not a tip, just a short, your cold voice saying, "They're coming." Stephen hung up, no questions, no goodbyes. He didn't even bother grabbing his bag. By 6:42 a.m., the knock came. 3 sharp thuds, then the crash of the door. FBI, guns, shouting. Stephen didn't fight, didn't flinch. He just stood, turned his hands over and let them cuff him like a man laying down his cards. They took him to the federal building downtown, same place he'd once walked into through the back entrance to feed agents intel on the mafia. Same building where he'd smiled, handed over names, then left to bury his own enemies in cold earth. This time, he entered through the front, a hallway of flashbulbs. Journalists shouting questions he didn't answer, cameras catching the deep lines under his eyes. He looked less like a gangster and more like an old, bitter man finally being pulled into the daylight. The arrest hit the news like a tidal wave. Top echelon informant arrested. FBI corruption investigation expands. Winter Hill boss in custody. Where is Whitey Bulger? That last headline was the one that made Stephen flinch, because he knew exactly where Whitey was. Gone. It wasn't a coincidence. The timing was too perfect. Stephen got arrested on a Thursday morning. Whitey disappeared the night before. No one could prove it at the time, but the pieces were obvious. Someone tipped him off. Someone on the inside. Someone who wanted Whitey gone before the ship went down. Stephen wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was just quiet. Because he understood something most men never learn until it's too late. You don't get betrayed by strangers. You get betrayed by the people you bled for. Inside the cell, time moved different. No more busy streets, no more coded phone calls, no more false power, just a metal toilet, a thin mattress, and the sound of your own guilt bouncing off four walls. They put him in isolation for the first few days. Protective custody, they called it. But Stephen knew better. It wasn't about protection, it was about control. He had information on everyone. Names, dates, murders, deals. And the FBI wanted to know exactly how much he'd talk before deciding whether to protect him or bury him deeper. For years, they'd covered for him. Now, they were covering themselves. He stared at the ceiling for hours each day, thought about the lives he'd erased, the bodies buried under South Boston, the women who loved him, the secrets he carried. But one name came back more than the rest. Whitey. The friend, the partner, the devil who dragged him to hell and left him there. They brought in a federal prosecutor on day 5, a quiet guy with thin glasses and a face like a funeral. He sat down across from Stephen, laid a folder on the table, and opened it slow. Inside, photos, dozens of them, victims, families, surveillance, Stephen's whole life laid out in black and white ink. The prosecutor tapped the folder. "We have enough to bury you," Stephen nodded. "I know. You can't play both sides anymore." Stephen said nothing. The man leaned forward. "If you want to live, Mr. Flemmi, now's the time to start telling the truth." That was the thing. Stephen had been lying for so long. He didn't even remember what the truth looked like. They charged him with racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, multiple counts of murder, and violations of the RICO Act. The list was longer than most confessions, but Stephen didn't flinch. What shook him wasn't the charges. It was the moment they showed him the witness list, names he hadn't heard in years, people he thought were dead or gone or loyal. Turns out when the ship sinks, the rats don't just jump, they swim to the nearest microphone. And Whitey's disappearance? That was the final betrayal. Stephen had protected him for 2 decades, lied for him, killed for him, even silenced the women who got too close. And in the end, Whitey ran, alone. The FBI held emergency press conferences. Spokesmen in suits stood in front of flags, pretending like they hadn't known the devil personally. Stephen Flemmi's relationship with the Bureau was complex. "We regret any past misjudgments. The Bureau is cooperating fully." Stephen almost laughed. The same men who once shook his hand with grins were now acting like he was just a ghost from a story they didn't write. The press was relentless. Reporters dug up old murders, victims' families stepped forward, protesters showed up outside courthouses with signs calling him a monster, a traitor, a killer with a badge on his back. He didn't argue, because what could he say? They weren't wrong. In his cell, Stephen wrote again. Not in the old black notebook. He never saw that again. This time, it was yellow legal paper. No codes, no riddles, just words. He wrote about Maria, about Deborah Davis, about Deborah Hussey. He didn't confess, not exactly. He just remembered. He wrote down how Maria used to hum while folding laundry, how Deborah Davis once tried to convince him to leave Boston and run away, how little Deborah Hussey used to fall asleep on the couch watching cartoons, blanket wrapped around her like armor. He folded the pages, slipped them into an envelope, never mailed them, because who was left to read them? Then came the worst part, the tapes. See, Whitey had recorded some of their conversations. Paranoid as ever, he'd wired up certain safe houses, kept the tapes, and when he vanished, someone found them. Those tapes landed in court. Stephen sat in a courtroom and listened to his own voice, cold, detached, discussing murders like grocery lists, laughing with Whitey about bodies, blood, and betrayal. The jurors looked at him like he was an alien, a monster in human skin. He didn't defend himself, didn't explain, because the truth was worse than any excuse he could offer. He had become the ghost, the man without a soul, the shadow in every nightmare. And now, he was just a number in a system he thought he'd mastered. One day, a guard leaned into his cell and asked, Do you want to know what the papers are calling you? Stephen didn't answer. The guard smirked. The ghost of Winter Hill. Stephen nodded once. Fitting? Because ghosts don't eat, don't sleep, don't age. They just haunt. There's a moment when a man finally stops running. It doesn't come with sirens or screams. It comes with a wooden chair, a quiet courtroom, and eyes that burn holes through your name. The United States vs. Stephen Flemmi. That was the title printed on the docket, but everyone in Boston knew it meant something else. It meant, this is where the silence ends. This is where the ghosts speak. This is where the devil's mask finally falls off. Stephen sat at the defense table in his beige prison uniform, older than most men in the room by decades. His eyes didn't roam. He didn't look for sympathy or familiar faces or mercy. He wasn't expecting any. The courtroom was packed wall to wall. Reporters scribbled notes as if the words being spoken were scripture. Cameras weren't allowed, but sketches would later show Stephen as hunched, expressionless, his hands folded, his jaw tight. But the people who mattered most weren't the ones writing articles. They were the ones sitting in the rows behind the prosecution table. Mothers, sisters, brothers, children of men and women who'd never come home. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching judgment. The charges were laid out like a horror story. 10 counts of murder, conspiracy to murder, RICO violations, obstruction of justice, illegal possession of firearms and explosives, corruption and bribery of public officials. And behind every charge, a face, a life, a story that ended too soon. One by one, the prosecution called them out. Victims buried in gravel lots, shot in cars, strangled in basements, dumped behind dumpsters. Men who crossed lines, women who knew too much. And at the center of it all, Stephen Flemmi and Whitey Bulger. The assistant U.S. attorney, a woman named Margaret Hennessy, didn't play up theatrics. She didn't need to. The facts were loud enough. She stood before the court and said, Stephen Flemmi wore two faces. One was the cold enforcer of the Winter Hill gang. The other was the FBI's top echelon informant. But behind both faces was a man who used trust as a weapon and silence as a tool of murder. Stephen listened without blinking. No emotion, no reaction. But inside, something small twisted. Because for the first time, someone had told the whole truth out loud. And the room believed her. The most brutal moment didn't come from a lawyer. It came from Marion Hussey. She was older now. Gray streaks in her hair, shoulders curved. Her hands trembled when she took the witness stand. The court went dead silent when she looked at Stephen. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at the man she once loved and said, You murdered my daughter. You killed her and buried her like she was trash. And I laid next to you for years, thinking you were the only man who ever protected us. Stephen looked at her, and for the first time during the entire trial, his eyes dropped. Marion continued, Deborah trusted you. She thought you were family. You were supposed to protect her. You used her. Then you choked the life out of her and helped hide her body like it meant nothing. You killed 2 generations of my family. There were no objections, no interruptions, just truth. And the sound of a mother's heart breaking. Again. Stephen didn't testify in his own defense. What was there to say? That he did what he had to? That he killed for survival? That he was raised in war and lived in shadows? He knew none of that mattered now. So instead, he sat through the trial like a man attending his own funeral. Each witness, another shovelful of dirt. Each charge, another nail in the coffin. Each photo, each document, each recorded wiretap, another piece of his soul dragged into the light. And the final blow came on day 27. The prosecution played a taped conversation from 1986. It was Stephen's voice, calm and calculated. We'll get rid of him. No mess, no cops. You do the hole, I'll bring the rope. The courtroom didn't move. Because everyone knew this wasn't just evidence, this was confession. The trial wasn't just about punishment, it was about legacy. For years, the Winter Hill Gang had been romanticized in Boston street lore. Robin Hood stories, tough guys with a code, legends told in bars and whispered over beers. But now it was on display for what it really was, a pack of men who traded loyalty for leverage, who killed friends and lovers with the same hands they used to shake deals, who let women die in basements and children grow up without fathers just to keep their own seats at the table. And Stephen, he wasn't the ghost anymore. He was the face of the rot. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom filled to capacity. Security was tight. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, some praying, some shaking with rage, some just staring at the man who'd stolen years they'd never get back. The judge didn't waste words. You were given every opportunity to change your path. You had access to justice, to law enforcement, to information, and instead, you used that power to kill, deceive, and destroy lives. You are a danger to society, and you have shown no remorse. Stephen Flemmi, you were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No clapping, no cheering, just relief. Because justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like a door finally closing. As Stephen was led away, handcuffed and expressionless, he looked out at the courtroom one last time. The people didn't look at him with fear anymore. They looked at him with pity. And somehow, that hurt worse. He used to be a name people whispered. Now he was just a case file, an old man who would die behind concrete walls, remembered only by the pain he left behind. And maybe that's the cruelest kind of justice. In the days after the trial, the city began to breathe again. The papers moved on. The bars changed names. The cops who took bribes retired quietly. The agents who looked away found new desks or disappeared into the silence. But for the families, there was no moving on. Stephen Flemmi may have been sentenced, but nothing brought back what was taken. The dead stayed dead. The wounds stayed open. The ghosts still walked the neighborhoods where it all began. And Stephen, he was moved to a federal prison in Pennsylvania, a cell, a bed, 3 meals, a yard surrounded by fences too tall to climb and walls too thick to scream through. He stopped writing, stopped talking. Some said he started praying. Others said he still had nightmares. No one really knew. Because the truth is, you don't get to understand a man like Stephen Flemmi. You only get to live with the aftermath. Prison isn't just bars and time. It's memory. It's silence so thick you start to hear the voices you tried to bury. Stephen Flemmi didn't fear dying there. He feared remembering everything he'd done. Allenwood Federal Correctional Complex in Pennsylvania wasn't a place for fresh killers or street punks. It was for men whose names used to mean something. Ex-politicians, former cartel bosses, white-collar crooks who used to sit in corner offices, and men like Stephen Flemmi. He arrived with no fanfare. No one cheered, no one booed. The staff didn't even say his name. Just handed him a uniform, a number, and walked him into a new kind of silence. His cell was 6 by 8 feet, concrete, fluorescent lights, thin bed, thin walls, no clocks. But time moved anyway, slow, like molasses poured through a rusted funnel. Stephen was 61 when he was sentenced, not quite old, but the years had settled into his bones like wet cement. He didn't walk with the power he once had, didn't carry himself like the Rifleman of Winter Hill. He was just another old con in a sea of has-beens. Most inmates gave him space. Some of the younger ones didn't know who he was. Others did, and kept their distance, not out of fear, but out of something else. Disgust. Stephen had broken the rules of the underworld, not by flipping. Plenty of men had done that, but by crossing lines even killers don't touch. Women, family, trust. His name didn't inspire respect anymore. It inspired revulsion. He fell into routine. Wake up, eat, walk the yard, read old newspapers, stare at the wall, repeat. He didn't talk much. Occasionally he'd nod at a guard or mumble something about the weather, but mostly he listened. He listened to the buzz of the lights, the scrape of metal doors, the coughs, snores. and murmurs of other lifers fading into their own regret. It was a new kind of prison, not just made of bars, but built out of memories. One day, 6 months into his sentence, he got a letter. The guard handed it to him like it was any other piece of paper, but Stephen knew better the moment he touched it. The handwriting, the slant of the letters, the way his name was written on the envelope, not as a convict, but as a man. He opened it slow. Inside was a single page, no return address, no signature, just this. I know what you did to her, I know where you buried her, and I hope the ghosts never let you sleep again. That was it. No threats, no name, no demands, just truth. Stephen read it 3 times, then folded it neatly, tucked it into his mattress, and lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling for hours. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He just remembered. Deborah Davis. She'd been his girlfriend. Beautiful, sharp, strong-willed. She challenged him, softened him even. There were nights he thought he could walk away from it all because of her. But she found out too much. About Whitey, about the murders, about the FBI deal. And Whitey saw her as a threat. Stephen let it happen. Some say he did it himself. Others say he stood there while it was done. But the truth? He made her walk into that house. He watched her die. And now, years later, her ghost had found its way through federal mail to remind him that there was no such thing as a past. The letter disturbed his routine. He didn't walk the yard that day, didn't eat dinner. He sat in his cell, listening for the sound of her voice. Sometimes it came, soft, in the corners of his mind. Not screaming, not angry, just disappointed. That was the part that hurt most. A few days later, he got another letter, different handwriting. This one was longer. It started, I was 8 when you killed my father. Stephen didn't need to read the rest. He knew who it was. The daughter of Arthur Bucky Barrett, a small-time thief they'd tortured and murdered for a stash of money and a whisper of disloyalty. They buried him in a basement. His family thought he'd left them. They never knew why until the story broke in the papers years later. Stephen forced himself to read every word. Every sentence felt like a blade. Not because they hurt, he was beyond pain, but because they cut away the silence he'd buried himself in. Prison didn't kill Stephen, it unburied him. Each day brought new memories, new details, new ghosts. Faces he'd forgotten, voices he'd muted, now returning in flashes and echoes. Sometimes he thought about Whitey, where he might be, what name he was living under, whether he was eating steak while Stephen scraped oatmeal off a plastic tray. He thought about what he'd do if they ever saw each other again. But those thoughts never lasted, because deep down, he knew. Whitey had beat him. He ran, he lived, Stephen stayed, Stephen rotted. The prison library became his church. He'd sit there for hours, flipping through old books, not reading, just looking. Sometimes law books, sometimes poetry, once even a Bible, not to repent, just to feel something. There was a guard, an older guy named Clark, who once asked him, "You ever feel bad about any of it?" Stephen didn't answer. Clark didn't push, just shrugged and walked away. But later that night, Stephen mumbled something into the dark. It wasn't supposed to go that far. He said it to no one, but it hung in the air like a confession. More letters came, not every day, not even every week, but enough to keep the wounds open. Some were from victims' families, some from reporters, some from people who had nothing to do with the story, just strangers who wanted to remind him he was hated. Stephen kept them all. He never wrote back, never destroyed them, just folded each one neatly and slipped it into a box under his bed. It became his cemetery, not of bodies, but of truths he could never outrun. 10 months into his sentence, he had a dream. He was back in Southie, in the bar where it all began. Whitey was sitting at the end of the bar, laughing. Maria was pouring drinks. Deborah was dancing. The jukebox was playing Sinatra, and Stephen, he was sitting alone, watching it all, unseen. He woke up sweating, and for the first time in years, he cried. Not like a gangster, not like a killer, but like a man who finally saw his own shadow for what it really was. They say prison slows everything down, but for Stephen Flemmi, it did the opposite. Every year behind bars aged him twice as fast, not because of the time, but because of what time forced him to remember. By the summer of 1996, Stephen had been behind bars for over a year. He knew the routine like the back of his hand. He knew which guards were worth nodding to. He knew the inmates who were killers and the ones who were just broken men acting tough. He also knew this. He wasn't feared anymore. The young guys didn't care about the name Flemmi. They didn't grow up in South Boston. They didn't know about the Winter Hill Gang or the FBI deals. They knew Tupac. They knew cartel hits. They knew cell phones, not payphones. Stephen was a relic, something out of a black and white movie rusting in the corner. He didn't mind it. Obscurity was a kind of peace. But peace, like everything else in his life, didn't last. It began with a letter, not the kind that haunted him. This one was typed, neat, professional, signed by a name he didn't recognize, Evan Morse, an investigative reporter from a national outlet. The letter was short, but it carried weight. Mr. Flemmi, I've been following your case for years. I've obtained classified documents regarding the FBI's top echelon program, many of which involve you directly. There are things in the files that were never shown in court. I'd like to talk, not to incriminate, but to understand. You have more control over your legacy than you think. Stephen read it twice, then a third time. Then, for the first time in months, he laughed. A dry, hollow sound, more cough than joy. Legacy? That was a word for men who built things. He didn't build anything. He just survived long enough to watch everything he touched rot. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat on it. Let it simmer. In prison, nothing is ever what it seems. A letter can be a rope or a noose. A conversation can be a lifeline or a setup. But something about this Morse kid felt different. Not hungry, not desperate, just curious. Stephen hated that, because curiosity had cost too many people their lives. A few weeks later, the warden called him into his office. Unusual. Stephen hadn't been in that room since his intake. The warden was a tall man with a clipped tone and a habit of checking his watch mid-sentence. He said, "You got a visitor. Special request. From D.C." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "FBI?" "No. Journalist. Evan Morse." Stephen stared for a moment, then said, "Let him in." They met in a private room. Glass wall, one guard outside the door, no cuffs. Stephen didn't care. If someone wanted him dead, now was as good a time as any. Morse was young, 30s, clean-shaven, eyes too sharp for comfort. He sat down, placed a recorder on the table, but didn't press play. "I appreciate you agreeing to this," he said. Stephen didn't reply. Morse took a breath. "I've read your transcripts, court files, interviews, the Bureau's redacted memos. I know what they say, but I want to hear what they don't." Stephen folded his hands. Morse leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, do you think you were used?" Silence. Then Flemmi responded, low, tired. "Used? No, I was welcomed. They knew exactly who I was, and they let me in anyway." Morse nodded. "Then why talk to me now?" Stephen looked up. His eyes weren't tired anymore. They were sharp, focused. Because when the devil comes for you, it's good to have someone else who knows what he looks like. For 2 hours, Stephen talked. Not about the murders, not directly, but about the system, the deals, the FBI handlers, about how the Bureau let him and Whitey operate like wolves in a slaughterhouse, as long as they brought back mafia heads on silver platters. He talked about the guilt, but not in tears. "Regret don't mean you didn't enjoy it," he said at one point. "It just means you lived long enough to realize the feeling don't last." Morse asked about Whitey, where he was, what he might be doing. Stephen only smiled. If he's smart, he's somewhere warm. If he's not, he's already dead. The interview made news. Morse published a piece titled, "The Ghost of Winter Hill, Stephen Flemmi's Final Words." It didn't paint him as a hero, or even as a misunderstood man. It painted him as what he was, a tired old killer who mistook survival for success and ended up drowning in his own silence. Stephen didn't mind the piece. In fact, he requested a printed copy. He folded it, tucked it inside the same box that held all the letters from victims' families, and placed it back under his bed. A little part of him, maybe the last part, felt seen. But peace was short-lived. One morning, during chow, a younger inmate approached his table. Tall, tatted, eyes like broken glass. "Yo, you really knew Whitey?" Stephen didn't answer. The kid smirked. "You ever think he's gonna come back for you?" Now Stephen looked up. Cold, sharp, no smirk, no fear. "Whitey don't come back for people," he said. "He runs over them on the way out." The kid laughed, but there was something behind it. Admiration, or maybe intent. Stephen kept an eye on him after that, because in prison, curiosity gets you killed. And this kid? He was looking for headlines of his own. A few nights later, a guard slipped him a note during count. No envelope, just paper, folded 4 ways. On it, "He's been spotted. New Mexico, another name. They're close." There was no signature. Stephen read it, burned it with a match from the kitchen, then sat in his cell for hours staring at nothing. Whitey, after all these years, still haunting him, still out there, still choosing when and where to pull the strings. That night, he dreamed of the basement again, but this time, he was in the chair. Whitey stood behind him, hands on his shoulders, whispering things he couldn't hear but somehow understood. When he woke up, his hands were shaking, and the guard found him at breakfast the next day, staring into his untouched tray like it held every name he'd ever buried. When you spend your life hiding bodies, you forget the world keeps turning above them. But graves don't stay closed forever, not when the people buried in them still have stories to tell. By 1997, Stephen Flemmi had nearly vanished from public memory. Whitey Bulger's disappearance was still the bigger headline. The ghost who escaped, the FBI's shame in a human shape, the devil Boston couldn't catch. Stephen, meanwhile, sat behind concrete and steel, forgotten by the streets, abandoned by the system that once protected him, alive, but fading. But silence never lasted long in his world, not in prison, not in his head, and certainly not when someone finally spotted Whitey. The report came from Santa Fe, New Mexico. An anonymous tip. Middle-aged man, fake identity, cashed money orders, paid rent in cash, disappeared before agents could move. They couldn't confirm it. But they were sure Whitey was alive. And just like that, the Bureau was back at Flemmi's door. Not literally. They didn't walk in with suits and briefcases like they used to. This time, they sent a message, through the warden. Stephen was called into a room with a speakerphone. A voice, flat, distant, came through. "Mr. Flemmi, we believe Mr. Bulger is active. We're asking for your cooperation. This could help reduce the hostility of your confinement." Stephen sat still. "And if I don't?" A pause. "You're not the only one who remembers where bodies are buried." Stephen chuckled. It was dry, cold. "Neither are you." The line went dead. That night, Stephen lay awake in his cell, not because of the threat, but because of the truth buried in it. He did know things no one else could ever know, because only he and Whitey had stood in certain rooms, held the same gun, watched the same lives go out like candles. The government didn't want closure, they wanted control. Whitey had embarrassed them, turned their secrets into punchlines. And now, they needed someone, anyone, to help them clean up the mess. But Stephen, he wasn't in the mood to clean anything. The following week, a new inmate arrived, Danny Russo, mid-30s, built like a boxer, fast mouth, faster fists, from Revere. Claimed his uncle used to run numbers under Howie Winter. He introduced himself to Stephen during lunch. "Hey, Mr. Flemmi, big fan." Stephen didn't respond. Danny smirked. "Heard stories about you, real ones, not the garbage on TV. You were the real deal." Still, silence. Danny leaned closer. "Bet you got a lot of enemies in here." "Me? I keep an eye out. You ever need someone? Stephen raised a hand. Stop talking. Danny blinked. Stephen stared at him, his voice quiet, dangerous. The ones who talk too much in here are usually the first ones found with their face in the toilet. Danny held up his hands, laughing it off. But Stephen didn't laugh. Over the next few days, Danny kept showing up. In the yard, in the chow line, even in the library. He wasn't aggressive, not loud, just persistent. And that's what made Stephen uneasy. He'd seen it before. Guys who got sent into prison with one job. They act friendly, make you trust them, get you to open up. Then they're on the stand, testifying for a deal. Or they pass what you say down the chain, until someone in the dark decides you're no longer worth breathing. Stephen had survived men like that before. But now at 63, with bones like stone and eyes that blurred under fluorescent lights, he wasn't sure how much longer he could stay ahead. One night during lights out, a note was slipped under his door, folded twice, written in the same hand as the tip about Whitey. Inside, "They want you gone. Don't talk. Don't trust the new kid." No name, no hint. But Stephen felt it in his gut. It was real. Someone still had his back, someone in the shadows. And that terrified him more than anything else, because whoever sent it knew everything. The next day, he was called to medical for a routine checkup. Stephen hadn't been sick, hadn't asked for anything. He walked slow, steady. Inside, the nurse looked surprised. "You're not on the list." Stephen nodded once, turned, and walked out. By the time he reached the hall, he saw Danny down the corridor, leaning on a wall like he'd been waiting, smiling. Stephen didn't smile back. That night, he made a decision. He didn't trust the feds, didn't trust the kid, didn't trust the guards, but he trusted the silence. So he wrote a note on old library paper. 4 words. "I'll talk. My way." Then flushed it. He wasn't making deals, but he was taking control on his terms. They wanted Whitey? He'd give them breadcrumbs, but nothing that would get him killed faster than he already was dying. 2 weeks passed. The guards moved Danny to another block after a dispute. Stephen never saw him again. He didn't ask questions, because in prison, when something disappears, you let it. Then came the visit. Unexpected. No appointment, just a name on the logbook, Evan Morse. Stephen met him again in the same room. This time, Evan looked different, not excited, worried. He sat down, pressed his hands flat on the table. "They found him." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "Whitey?" Evan nodded. "Well, someone who fits the profile, in Arizona. He was gone by the time they got there. But this time, they're close." Stephen leaned back. "I hope they find him," he said flatly. Evan leaned in. Do you really?" Stephen didn't blink. "I hope they find him and realize the real devil is already inside their house." That night, he sat in his cell. No letters, no noise. Just the thought, what if Whitey's watching me now, not through a camera, but from somewhere far away, laughing as the world turns on the man who stayed loyal too long? That's the thing about the devil. He doesn't come for you with horns and fire. He comes wearing your best friend's face. Some ghosts wear white sheets. Others walk into a prison visiting room with your mother's eyes and your name in their mouth. Stephen Flemmi wasn't expecting anyone that morning. His back was aching from the concrete mattress, and his eyes hadn't shut all night. He'd been up pacing, thinking about Whitey, about the rumor in Arizona, about the warning note and the kid who vanished. He hadn't thought about family in years. That part of his life had been cut off long before the cuffs, long before the courtrooms, maybe even before the first body dropped. In his mind, the people who shared his blood didn't share his burden. He preferred it that way. So when a guard knocked and said, "You got a visitor," Stephen raised his eyebrows. "Who?" The guard just shrugged. "Female, not press. Says it's personal." Stephen almost said no, then he didn't. He got up, straightened his shirt, combed what was left of his hair with his fingers, and followed the guard down the hallway. The visitation room was quiet that morning. Only 2 booths were occupied, a young guy talking to his crying mother. and a man in orange trying to get his girlfriend to stop yelling. Stephen's guest sat at the back. He didn't recognize her at first. Maybe it was the hair, dark brown, tied tight behind her neck. Maybe it was the age, late 30s, maybe early 40s, or maybe it was just the years between them, packed with blood and silence. Then he saw her eyes, and the name came back like a knife to the chest. Catherine. She looked up, met his stare, didn't blink. He sat down across from her, picked up the phone. She didn't. She just stared. Then finally, she whispered through the glass, "I wanted to know what kind of man you really are." Catherine wasn't just another distant niece or random relative. She was his daughter, illegitimate, secret, born to a woman Stephen had been with briefly, long before the Winter Hill gang took up most of his soul. The mother had kept her distance. Stephen had sent money, quietly, no contact, no names, no visits. The arrangement suited them both. But now, decades later, here she was, flesh and blood, with the face of a woman who didn't know if she came to hate him or understand him. "You knew about me," she said. Stephen nodded slowly. "You never visited, never wrote." He didn't respond. "You sent money." A pause. "I wanted you to stay away, until I didn't," she whispered. "And by then, I was too ashamed to ask." Stephen leaned forward, picked up the phone. His voice cracked more than he liked. "I thought keeping you away would keep you safe." She laughed, a bitter small sound. "Safe from what? From knowing who you are, or from becoming you?" That cut deeper than he let her see. For the next 45 minutes, Catherine didn't ask questions. She delivered answers, truths Stephen didn't know, or maybe chose not to believe. Her mother died of cancer. Catherine put herself through school, married once, divorced, no kids, no arrests, no drugs. "I survived," she said, "without you. But I never stopped thinking about where I came from." Then, the question, the one he had dreaded since she walked in. "Did you kill Deborah Davis?" Stephen stared at her. The room seemed to shrink. The air thickened. And for once, he didn't lie. He didn't justify, didn't deflect. He just nodded. Once, a small, tired gesture, a man not seeking forgiveness, just finally offering truth to the one person who might still matter. Catherine didn't cry. She looked down, then said, "Thank you for not lying." And then she got up. Just like that. No hug. No goodbye. Just the sound of a chair scraping the floor as she walked out of his life. Again. That night, Stephen sat on his bed and stared at the floor until lights out. He didn't eat, didn't read, didn't sleep. Because for the first time in years, he wanted to go back, not to undo what he'd done, but to warn the version of himself that once thought he could hold love in one hand and blood in the other. He couldn't. No one could. The next morning, the FBI came calling, this time in person. 2 agents, not the old ones, young, sharp suits, clean haircuts. They didn't come in offering deals or smiles. They came with pressure. They had photos, phone records, rumors out of Mexico, Nevada, Arizona. Whitey was still out there, and the heat was rising. They believed he had a new name, a woman with him, and access to a stash of money that had never been found. They wanted to know, did Stephen know where the stash was? Did he remember any properties, safe houses, contacts? Stephen leaned back in his chair. "I remember a lot, but I've also forgotten enough to stay alive." The agents weren't amused. One of them said, "If you help us, we can make things easier for you. Better placement, a transfer, less isolation. But if you stay silent, this place stays your coffin." Stephen stared at him. "You think I'm afraid to die? After everything I've done?" The room went quiet. Then Stephen added softer, "You think dying matters after you've already killed the only parts of yourself that meant something." They left without another word. The next few weeks passed in quiet dread. Catherine didn't return. More articles surfaced about Whitey, possible sightings, none confirmed. The FBI circled like wolves with clipboards. But something in Stephen had shifted. He no longer cared if Whitey got caught. He no longer cared if the feds came back. He no longer even cared if he lived to see the next snowfall. All he wanted was peace. Not the kind the world gives, the kind you carve out for yourself in the last years of a life soaked in regret. He started writing again. Letters to Catherine. Most of them he didn't send. He tucked them into his mattress like confessions folded into prayers. Sometimes he just wrote her name over and over, as if writing it might keep her alive in the part of him that hadn't died with Deborah Davis. But even peace is earned. And for Stephen Flemmi, peace always came with a price. And that price was coming soon. Most killers expect to die with a bang, a gunshot, a knife, a final scream. Stephen Flemmi almost died by a spoon. It happened on a Wednesday. Lunch was spaghetti, the bland kind, half-warm noodles, sauce like red water. Stephen sat alone, as usual, his tray untouched, his back to the wall. He always watched the doors. It was habit, old muscle memory. From the days when walking into the wrong bar could get you shot in the back of the head before your coat hit the stool. He saw the kid coming from the moment he entered the cafeteria. Not Danny Russo, the one who disappeared months ago. This was someone else. Younger, eyes jittery, the kind of twitch you only see in addicts or men already halfway to death. He was holding a tray, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was how tight his grip was on the plastic spoon in his right hand. Modified, filed to a point, prison style. Stephen moved to stand. Too late. The kid lunged, let out a grunt that echoed over the chatter, and drove the spoon forward like a shiv. Stephen twisted at the last second. The spoon cut his shoulder, not deep, but enough to tear through his shirt and draw blood. Then came the tackle. Guards slammed the kid to the ground, screaming, cuffs, chaos. Stephen sat back down, silent, bleeding, smiling. Because he understood something in that moment. This wasn't personal. This was a message. Someone still wanted him dead. In the infirmary, the nurse asked him if he recognized the attacker. Stephen said no. He did. Didn't know his name. But he'd seen him in the yard, hanging around a group of guys with too many tattoos and not enough brains. But the attack wasn't about prison politics. This was about what he knew. And someone, maybe inside, maybe out, wanted him silenced before he opened his mouth. The old threats were back, but this time they didn't wear badges. They wore prison uniforms and empty eyes. Back in his cell, he found a note under his mattress. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten, sloppy, almost rushed. Next time it won't miss, keep your mouth shut. Stephen stared at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it, set it on fire with a match, and flushed the ashes. He didn't sleep that night. But he didn't flinch either, because fear didn't control him anymore. What controlled him now was curiosity. Who was still afraid of him? And what exactly were they trying to hide? 3 days later, an unexpected name showed up on the visitor log. Jimmy Burns. Stephen hadn't heard that name in 30 years. Jimmy had been a small-time fence back in the 70s, ran goods between Dorchester and Charlestown. Not a killer, not even a tough guy, but connected in his own quiet way. Most people thought he vanished after the Winter Hill days died out. Apparently, he didn't vanish. He just went underground. Now he was here, standing on the other side of a reinforced glass window, wearing a cheap suit and a face that looked like it had been dragged through 3 decades of regret. Stephen picked up the phone. Jimmy's voice was gravel and smoke. "You look like shit, Stevie." Stephen didn't smile. "So do you." Jimmy looked around, then leaned closer to the glass. "I'm not here to reminisce. I'm here because people are nervous. You're talking to the feds again." Stephen didn't answer. Jimmy continued. "Word is, you still know where it is. The money. The stash Whitey left behind." Stephen's face stayed stone still. "I don't care about the money," Jimmy scoffed. "Maybe not, but other people do." "People still stupid enough to chase ghosts?" Jimmy leaned in. "Not ghosts, Stevie. Real people. Still alive, still watching. And if they think you might give it up, they'll bury you before your next meal tray." Stephen's voice was low. "Then they should have done it already." Jimmy shook his head. Don't be cocky. You're not bulletproof anymore. You're not even news. Then why are you here? Jimmy paused, then said something Stephen hadn't expected. Because I owe you, and I'm here to give you a choice. Stephen's eyes narrowed. What choice? You tell me what you know. I protect it. I keep it out of the wrong hands. You go quiet, the heat dies down, and maybe, just maybe, you live to rot a little longer. Stephen chuckled. It wasn't amusement, it was pity. You still think this is about money? Jimmy didn't blink. Isn't it always? Stephen shook his head. The stash never mattered. What mattered was what was buried with it. After the visit, Stephen sat in his cell and replayed every conversation he'd ever had with Whitey. Every coded phrase, every real estate reference, every map drawn on napkins. And one memory stood out. A garage in Quincy. Late 1989. Whitey had taken him there, said it belonged to a friend who'd moved to Florida. Inside, behind a stack of old tires, under a loose floor tile, was a metal box. Stephen hadn't looked inside. Whitey told him, if I die, that's where you go. Back then, Stephen assumed it was cash, maybe weapons, fake passports. Now, he wasn't so sure, because whatever was in that box still had people scared, even with Whitey gone, even with Stephen locked up. And that meant one thing. It wasn't money. It was leverage. The next morning, a guard passed Stephen a sealed envelope. No return address. Inside, one photograph. A blurry shot of a garage, faded sign above it, Baker & Sons Auto, and written on the back, remember, you're not the only one who knows. Stephen stared at the photo for a long time. He folded it, slid it into his Bible. Not because he found God, but because if you're going to hide something in hell, you put it in the last place the devil would look. That night, Stephen sat on the edge of his bed and did what he hadn't done in years. He prayed, not for forgiveness, not for peace, but for one last opportunity to decide how this story ends. Some men die in their sleep, others die screaming. Stephen Flemmi had always known he'd die remembering. It was a Tuesday when the body turned up, a younger inmate, not well known, not important. But the way he died said everything. Throat slashed, in the showers, no witnesses, no sound. Stephen didn't know the kid personally, never spoke to him, but he'd seen him hanging around the same circle as that twitchy-eyed attacker from the cafeteria. And that was enough to make the message loud and clear. We're still here, we're still watching, and we're getting closer. The guards locked the place down for 48 hours. Strip searches, cell checks, yard privileges suspended, tempers flared. Inside his cell, Stephen sat quietly, breathing slow, hands folded. The silence didn't bother him anymore. He'd made peace with the sound of waiting. What bothered him now was the thing he couldn't ignore, that garage in Quincy, the box under the tiles, and the fact that someone else knew about it. The question wasn't just what was inside anymore. The question was, what happens if the wrong person gets to it first? 3 days after the lockdown, the FBI came back. Same agents as before. Younger, colder, more aggressive now. They didn't sit this time. Didn't pretend they were building a relationship. They came with documents, photos, a signed affidavit from a former associate of Jimmy Burns. It wasn't just hearsay anymore. They had coordinates. They'd found the garage. And now, they wanted permission to search it, with Stephen's cooperation. Here's the deal, one of them said, sliding the paper forward. You give us details, confirm what's inside. We unseal it together, you stay safe. You get transferred. You live longer. Stephen didn't touch the paper. He stared at it like it was radioactive, because he knew. Whatever was in that garage wasn't just dangerous to the streets. It was dangerous to the government, to the Bureau, to him. Whitey had once said something to him back in 1988. They were sitting in a diner in Revere, drinking coffee and pretending they weren't monsters. You know what scares the feds more than guys like us? Whitey said. Stephen had shrugged. Whitey grinned. Paper trails, blackmail, evidence that lives longer than we do. Stephen didn't ask what he meant at the time. Now, in a prison room with 2 agents breathing down his neck, he finally understood. That box was insurance. Not just for Whitey, maybe even for Stephen himself. He looked up at the agents. "What happens if I say no?" One of them smirked. "Then we open it anyway, but you don't get to shape what comes out." The other leaned in. "And the people watching you in here? They'll know you didn't cooperate. They'll think you flipped. Again." Stephen didn't flinch, but his heart beat a little harder. He wasn't afraid of being called a rat. He was afraid of dying for a secret he didn't even control anymore. That night, back in his cell, he found a new note tucked under his mattress. Same sloppy handwriting as before. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a list. 5 names, 4 were dead. The 5th, his daughter, Catherine. His hands trembled for the first time in months. Because now it wasn't just about him. They weren't just trying to bury the past anymore. They were ready to salt the earth. He didn't sleep. He stared at the photo of the garage tucked inside the Bible and thought about every step that had led him here. The murders, the betrayals, the deals, the women, the silence, and then the fork in the road. Give them the box, or protect it. Expose Whitey's last secret, or protect it and die knowing he kept something out of their hands. The next morning, he asked to speak to the warden. Alone, no lawyers, no agents, just a single request. "I'll cooperate," he said, "but only in person, and only if I'm there when it opens." The warden raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" Stephen nodded. "If I die, I want to die with my eyes open." 2 weeks later, under heavy supervision, Stephen was transferred to a federal facility closer to Quincy, Massachusetts. The press didn't catch wind of it. No headlines, no leaks. Just a quiet movement of a dying man toward a ticking bomb buried in the floor of a forgotten auto shop. They didn't tell him what they'd found so far, didn't mention whether they'd already opened the box. They were playing poker. But Stephen knew how to read faces. They were nervous, which meant the box was still sealed, which meant he still had power. The day they brought him to the garage was overcast, gray skies, cold air. The building was fenced off. The sign above the garage door rusted into barely legible letters. Inside, the floor was just as he remembered it. Oil stains, cracked tiles, a workbench no one had touched in decades. They pointed to the corner where the tires used to be. Now, just a bare patch of floor, a tile already pried loose, a square of darkness beneath it. The box sat inside. Dusty, metal, unlocked, but unopened. They handed him gloves. "You open it." Stephen stared at it. It looked smaller than he remembered, less like a treasure chest, more like a coffin. He knelt. His knees cracked, his breath trembled. His fingers gripped the edge of the lid, and in one slow motion, he opened it. Inside, a manila envelope, a reel of film, a small black notebook, and a badge, FBI. Stephen stared at it all. He didn't touch anything, just stared. Because he knew instantly, this wasn't just leverage, it was a map of rot, evidence of a second informant program, names of agents, judges, politicians, people who had kept Whitey and Stephen protected for 2 decades, some dead, some still in power. And the badge? It wasn't Connolly's, it belonged to someone still on active duty. One of the agents stepped forward. "We'll take it from here." Stephen looked up. His voice was hoarse but steady. "You open that without a full team and a federal judge watching, and your name's going to be in the next box I bury." The agent froze, because in that moment, he knew. Flemmi wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a witness, and maybe the last man alive who could burn it all down. Secrets don't die in the dark, they rot, until someone opens the box and the whole world starts to stink. Stephen Flemmi was returned to prison under the kind of silence that makes men paranoid. There were no announcements, no press, not even a mention in internal memos. The FBI wanted it quiet. But quiet didn't exist in places like this. Inside those walls, whispers traveled faster than blood, and by the time he stepped back into his cell, half the block already knew something had changed. Stephen wasn't just another old gangster anymore. He was a man holding something the system wanted buried. And men like that, they don't usually die of old age. He didn't sleep the first night back. Every noise made him sit up. Every footstep sounded like the start of something permanent. He'd been hunted before. But this was different. Before, they came for his power. Now, they were coming for his silence. And silence had become a currency he couldn't afford to spend. The next morning, the warden called him in. No guards, no agents, just one man in a tight office with the blinds half shut and a look like he hadn't slept either. "You made a mess," the warden said. Stephen didn't answer. The man leaned forward. "You opened something they didn't want opened." "You understand that?" Stephen shrugged. "It wasn't locked. They're watching you now. They've always watched me." The warden's voice lowered. "Not like this. You're a liability now, Flemmi. You're not being protected. You're being monitored. And if someone gets to you before they do," Stephen cut him off, "then maybe I die knowing something they don't." That shut the room down, for a few seconds at least. When he returned to his cell, there was a note on his bed. It wasn't handwritten this time. Typed, bold, straightforward. "This is your last warning. Stay quiet or you won't make it to Christmas." Stephen sat down slowly. December was only 6 weeks away. He folded the note, slid it into the Bible again, not because it was holy, but because if the devil ever wanted to read it, he'd know where to look. That night, Catherine called. The prison didn't allow direct calls, but the FBI made an exception. They wanted to see what he'd say. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You did it," she said. Stephen leaned back. "Did what?" "You opened it, whatever that thing was, that box." She didn't ask what was in it. She wasn't here for the facts. She was here for the fallout. "There's a reporter outside my apartment now," she continued. "He says my name was mentioned, in connection to you." Stephen closed his eyes. He hadn't meant for that. Not her. Never her. "You're not in danger," he said, though he wasn't sure. She laughed bitterly. "That's rich coming from the man who made danger his career." Silence. Then, softer. "They're going to kill you." He knew. Let them try. Another pause. Then Catherine said something that landed harder than any threat. "If you die now, you'll leave nothing but shadows behind. So for once, don't be a coward. Finish it. Tell the truth, all of it." Then the line went dead. For the next 2 weeks, Stephen wrote. Not letters, not confessions. A statement typed on a prison typewriter. 10 pages, every name, every payoff, every tape, every memory Whitey and the FBI had tried to hide. He didn't send it to the bureau, didn't send it to the judge, didn't even send it to Catherine. He sent it to Evan Morse, the reporter, along with a simple instruction. "If I die, print this." 2 days after the package was received, Evan showed up for a visit. He looked tired, pale, like someone had followed him for 3 nights and whispered through his mail slot. "They don't want me publishing it," he said, eyes darting to the guards. "I've had 2 calls from bureau contacts. A cease and desist from a law firm I've never heard of. Someone even hacked my email." Stephen just looked at him. "You scared?" Evan swallowed hard. "Yeah, but I'm still here." That earned the man a rare flicker of respect. Stephen leaned in. "There's more. In Boston, safety deposit box. You'll need a lawyer to get access. My lawyer, if she's still alive." Evan nodded. "Name?" Stephen told him. The name meant nothing to Evan, but it meant everything to the people who still remembered the case, because she was the only person who had ever refused to lie for the Winter Hill Gang. That night, Stephen returned to his cell and waited. He knew what came next. The prison wouldn't protect him, the feds wouldn't step in, and the bureau had enough incentive to let him disappear quietly. So he did the only thing he had left. He cleaned his cell, folded his sheets, wrote his will, 1 page, handwritten, left his personal books in a box labeled library, and then he sat, waiting. But death didn't come that night, or the next, because something had shifted. The bureau had lost control. Evan Morse had published a teaser, just a paragraph, no names, no dates, just this. A convicted gangster, dying in prison, claims to have proof that the FBI protected murderers, allowed innocent people to die, and buried evidence for decades. And now, the ghosts are ready to speak. The press went wild. The bureau shut down. And Stephen? He slept for the first time in 3 weeks. But peace is never permanent, especially not when you're the last man holding the matches and the gasoline. There was no trumpet, no bullet through the eye, no concrete shoes. When Stephen Flemmi died, it wasn't with violence. It was with truth pressing down on his chest like a weight he'd carried too long. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where it ends. And more importantly, how. The week after Evan Morse's article teaser dropped, the world shifted. Not dramatically, not with fire and headlines, but with whispers, investigations, and panic among men who thought their sins were already buried. Retired agents, old mob lawyers, federal prosecutors, even a sitting judge. Somehow, all of them were tethered by threads that led back to that box in Quincy. It wasn't just a record of corruption, it was a blueprint for how the Winter Hill Gang had stayed untouchable for 20 years. And now, Flemmi had flipped the light switch. Inside prison, things got colder, not temperature-wise, people. Inmates stopped talking to him. Guards wouldn't meet his eyes. His food trays looked a little too identical each day. Like maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for him to drop. He stopped eating them. Lived on commissary. Not because he thought he'd live long enough for it to matter, but because when death came, he wanted it to look him in the face, not crawl in through his stomach. One afternoon, during library duty, he felt the air change. Not a physical breeze. Just that shift. The kind you feel when someone behind you is walking with intention. He turned just in time to see a sharpened toothbrush coming at his throat. The man was fast, late 20s, gang tattoos, not someone Flemmi had seen before. But he'd expected this. He dodged, not fully, just enough to keep the point from his artery. The plastic sliced his cheek, deep, sharp. Blood hit the shelf beside a book on American presidents. Guards tackled the kid. Screams, orders. Stephen staggered back, one hand to his face, the other steadying himself on a copy of Crime and Punishment. Fitting. They stitched him up, 5 inches, no nerve damage, just a new scar. He asked the nurse dryly, "Am I still pretty?" She didn't laugh. They moved him to isolation for protection, but Stephen knew what it really was. A waiting room, no phone calls, no visits, no library duty, no sunlight, and no clue whether Evan Morse had published the full statement or if Catherine had survived the fallout. The walls were blank, the bed stiff, the air dead. He counted minutes and heartbeats, because clocks didn't matter anymore. Only consequences. Then, 7 days later, the door opened, and everything changed. A man stepped in. Not a guard, not an agent. He wore a suit too clean for this place, face like concrete, eyes like frost. He pulled a chair up to the cell bars and sat down. Said one word, "Stephen." Flemmi looked up, recognized him immediately, not because of the face, but because of the badge. The same badge found in that box, the one that didn't belong to Connolly. The active duty agent from the top echelon file, the real handler, the man who had kept Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi safe for decades. Now he was here, without a name, without an ID, just purpose. "You made a mistake," the man said. Stephen smiled. The scar on his cheek stretched tight. "I made a few. You're forcing us to clean up history." "You wrote it." The man nodded, slowly. "That's the problem. We wrote it in ink. You dug it up in blood." Silence stretched between them. Then the man said something strange. "I admired you once. You were efficient, smart, loyal." Stephen's voice was dust. "Loyalty's a gun. Sooner or later it points both ways." The man leaned forward. "There's still a way out. You rescind your statement, deny it publicly, say it was fabricated, say Evan Morse twisted it. We let you live." Stephen laughed. Not loud, but real. "You've had 30 years to kill me. You waited this long to offer a deal. You're either scared or running out of places to hide." The man stood up, didn't argue, just said, "You have a week," and left. Stephen didn't need a week. He made his decision the next morning. He called the warden, requested a notarized declaration. He didn't retract a word. Instead, he added more. Confirmed the stash wasn't just money. It included surveillance tapes from FBI offices, some showing agents directing hits. Named 2 additional judges who'd buried wiretap evidence for political favors. Described how he and Whitey had laundered cash through a church front in South Boston. It was the last truth he'd tell, and the one most likely to seal his fate. That night, he wrote Catherine one final letter. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't apologize. He simply wrote, "This world didn't make me. I chose it. But I'm choosing something else now, and I hope you choose better." He signed it with just, "Dad." Then folded it, sealed it, left it for the guard to deliver. 3 days later, they found him in his cell, dead. No struggle, no wounds. Just a man lying flat on his back, eyes closed, lips slightly parted. Autopsy ruled it a heart attack. Official cause, natural causes. Unofficially, no one bought it. Not in that facility, not in that moment, not with everything that had happened. Someone had flipped the switch, turned off the last witness, and now the Bureau could move on, or so they thought. Because a week later, Evan Morse published the full statement, every page, every name, every deal. He attached the badge number of the agent who visited Flemmi, posted excerpts from the box, released redacted versions of surveillance logs, and ended the piece with a single quote. Stephen Flemmi did not ask for redemption. He simply refused to lie one more time. Catherine attended the funeral. There were no flowers, no priest, no mourners. Just a pine box in a city plot and the quiet sound of dirt hitting wood. She stood in the rain, alone, holding the letter he wrote her, not crying, just still. A week later, she sat with Evan Morse in a cafe near the courthouse. They were both marked by it now. Different kinds of scars, same origin. She handed him a USB drive. "Found it in the deposit box," she said. Took a lawyer to unlock it. He plugged it into his laptop. Dozens of files, dozens of tapes. Stephen's voice recorded. Interviews with Whitey. Conversations about murders, bureau cover-ups, evidence that no one had seen. Voices of men long dead, now echoing in the digital dark. It was the last gift of a man who had taken so much, and finally given something back. The story spread. Some denied it, some resigned. One judge vanished completely. The Bureau held a press conference full of stuttering and vague answers. No apologies, just containment. Because that's what the system does best. But in some corner of Boston, in some bar where the old-timers still talk, someone will mention Flemmi, and someone else will say, "He should have died in the streets," and someone else will add, "He did. Just took longer than it should have." And that's the story of Stephen Flemmi, the man who lived a double life, who served the government and the gangsters, who buried bodies and hid truths, who chose silence until silence threatened someone he loved, and who finally told the truth, even if it killed him.